What if there's more than one universe? After all, there's more than one planet, more than one star, more than one galaxy, more than one cluster of galaxy. So why not study this fascinating question? One that's captured the imagination of scientists and thinkers for centuries, sparking debate in physics, philosophy, theology, and more.
Other possibilities are out there, and isn't this an elegant way, in the absence of dynamical methods, to come up with a solution?
Today on the Into the Impossible podcast, we have the incredible opportunity to dive headfirst into this investigation with one of the leading experts in the field, physicist, author, and three-time guest on the Into the Impossible podcast, Professor Paul Halpern. He's a professor of physics at St. Joseph's University and the author of 18 popular science books, including Flashes of Creation, The Quantum Labyrinth, Einstein's Dice, Schrodinger's Cat, and Synchronicity.
What if we can't explain everything through directly detectable means? Do we consider the idea of things that might be outside direct detection?
Join us as we explore the multiverse theory and its implications for our understanding of all reality. Let's dive deep. Into the multiverse we go. Paul, how are you doing today in the city of brotherly love?
I'm doing great, and thank you for having me on again, Brian. I think this is my third time. It's really amazing to be on your show again.
I love it. You keep writing books. I think you're writing a book right now as we speak with your left hand. I can't see your left hand, but it would not surprise me, Paul, because you're such a prolific author, such a delight. You're a physicist slash physicist author. You know, kind of books that could be devoured but appreciated and savored. And this book is no different. And I want to start by doing what you're never supposed to do, which is to judge a book by its cover, a feature we've added since your previous book that made your appearance, I think 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. Jeez. This book is called The Allure of the Multiverse. So, Paul, do what you're not supposed to do. Explain the title, the subtitle, and this mysterious, effervescent cover illustration that's so beautiful.
So first of all, the title is meant to convey a little bit of ambiguity, because my feeling going into the book is that there are good reasons to want to investigate ideas of a multiverse, but there are good reasons for people to say, hey, wait a minute, that's not really science. So I appreciate both sides of the argument. I know people who are kind of aghast that I would even write a book about the multiverse. They use Pauli's famous quote, "It's not even wrong," to condemn it. And then there are people who kind of surprise me, because there are hard-headed astrophysicists like Virginia Trimble, who I'm sure you know, at UC Irvine, and she's done all this observatory work over the years. She's one of the first women to get observatory time, and she's written a lot about the history of physics. And I interviewed her, and she said, wait a minute, in the past, people weren't sure if there were other solar systems. They weren't sure if there were planets around other stars. Even about 100 years ago, they weren't sure if there were other galaxies outside the Milky Way. And every time people talk about other things, it turns out to be right. So she said, well, maybe I would bet on this idea of other universes being right too. And that kind of surprised me, but I kind of see the logic there too. And she's a very hard-headed astrophysicist. So and of course Martin Rees, the astronomer royal, who she is friends with and respects, is a big supporter of multiverse ideas. So it's there people show up on both sides of the issue of whether or not we should even take this seriously. And I'm not saying in the book that anything in the book is factual, it's hypothetical, but that we should take it seriously. And there are very serious reasons, including reasons suggested by Steven Weinberg about explaining the small size of the cosmological constant, which I'll talk about later, to take multiverse ideas very seriously. So that's why I say allure. It's something that is kind of a little bit of a seduction, a little bit of an enticement to go to other universes to try to explain the observable universe. But it's not necessarily the best way to do things. It's a possibility. If we could explain the observable universe with completely detectable methods, I think everybody would be on board with that. Like, okay, we can explain everything with things that are completely detectable. That's great. But what if we can't explain everything through directly detectable means? Do we consider the idea of things that might be outside direct detection? And that's what I talk about in the book. Now, the cover was done by a very talented artist. I don't know who. I guess I could look in the inside cover and find out who the artist was. But somebody did a great job with expressing the idea of multiple worlds, different versions of Earth with different color schemes to convey the idea of many worlds. And the subtitle are some of the topics I look at the book: higher dimensions, which in a way is a kind of multiverse if you consider the idea that there might be other membranes out there that collide with ours. It's a little bit of a multiverse idea. Although, interestingly, people who support that idea are saying it's not a multiverse, but I would call that a variation of a multiverse. And parallel universes, other worlds, going back to the idea of Giordano Bruno that there are many worlds, and in fact, an infinity of worlds out there that we don't detect, which was very prescient of him. That wraps up the cover, the subtitle, the title.
Hey there, it's me, your fearless host, Professor Brian Keating. I hope you're enjoying this interview with my friend, Paul Halpern. If you're as captivated by these cosmic mysteries as I am, I'm really hoping you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel and follow the show on your favorite podcasting platform. You'll be able to find this episode and many, many more conversations. Again, this is Paul's third time on the podcast. You don't want to miss the previous two, as well as the interviews I've done with other incredible intellectuals, astronauts, thinkers, Nobel Prize winners, and more. So hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to this or watching this and join us on the voyage into the impossible.
So yeah, that's a very expedient and efficient way to look at it. I did want to start with Bruno because it's one of my pet peeves, and I've told this to our mutual friend Will Kinney, who's endorsed the book as what he calls an informative and entertaining read, whichever corner of the multiverse you inhabit. Multiverse makes appearances in popular culture and media. Talked to a character in this book who's very significant, Kip Thorne, recently in my podcast for his new book. He features in this book. And Will Kinney's book, which is called An Infinity of Worlds, after the Bruno world. I picked up on with him. I want to pick it with you too, even though I love and respect you. Bruno, in my mind, wasn't talking about multiverses as universes, anything of the sort that we now, and now meaning in the last couple hundred years, have conceived of this term. I mean, when you and I were kids, the universe was everything there is. Now, the multiverse could be everything there is. But I believe that Bruno was looking at stars and hypothesizing that they could have actual planets on them. And for his troubles, they burned him at the stake. But he was also kind of a jerk in some ways. I mean, he was a very arrogant, thought that the church would, kind of forgive his brilliance, as was Galileo, who didn't learn from Bruno's execution. And he proceeded 30 years to the day, 32 years later, to make the same kinds of mistakes. But let's talk about that. What kind of multiverse, if any, was Bruno really talking about? Or was he talking about alien worlds?
To clarify, I don't claim that Bruno came up with the idea of the multiverse. I actually mention the real ideas of the multiverse really started with Hugh Everett in the 1950s, and that was popularized by Bryce DeWitt in the 1970s, and really took off at the turn of this century when people started wondering, why is the cosmological constant so small? Why are there so many string vacua and all these things, and said, hey, wait a minute, maybe we can talk about an array of universes. But I just mentioned Bruno just from the point of view, and very briefly in the book, from the idea that people speculate about things that you cannot observe. And it's possible that it's lucky that we've been able to find exoplanets and detect exoplanets. But of course, when I was little, the furthest planet out there was Pluto, of course, which is not considered a planet anymore. So things have really changed. And, it was unclear, even when I was little, if we'd be able to detect exoplanets. And there were some failed attempts at detecting exoplanets, which turned out, in one case, Peter Van de Kamp at the Sproul Observatory, as I talk about in one of my earlier books, claimed to have found an exoplanet around Barnard Star. And then his assistant, another person in his department, Wolf Hines, said, hey, wait a minute, you just took apart the telescope and reassembled it. It's a glitch in your detection methods. And he was furious, but turned out to be a false sighting of an exoplanet. So we could still be in a situation where exoplanets are unobservable. And in that case, we would say, hey, wait a minute, we really think there must be planets from our models, there must be planets around other stars, but we haven't observed them yet. And of course, gravitational waves were not observed until relatively recently. And there are things that we believe that are essentially not observable. Like we believe that an interior of a black hole has certain properties, but we can never observe an interior of a black hole and make it out safely. There are things in the universe, and I argue beyond the observable radius of the universe, there's a lot out there that we can observe. And that was my point with Bruno, is that at that time, no one could possibly have observed exoplanets, and yet he speculated about it. And you could say, well, is that science or was that science fiction? So someone could have said, like, that's not even wrong. There's no way to prove or disprove that. So why are you even saying that, Bruno? And, so that was kind of my point, is that our range of what we can observe continues to increase. So sometimes things that are speculation to one generation and even idle speculation, even laughed at, turn out to be real in the next generation.
Yeah, and I think it's of course not an easy concept for people to grapple with, but it's a popular concept, so it's strange. It's almost like we have this great concept that, in the words of Carl Sagan, who used to say, never have we lived in an age so ignorant about science but so dependent on technology. And Carl Sagan makes an appearance in this book because of the Ellie Arroway time transport. And fun fact: I had the co-author for that book, which is Ann Druyan, who wrote Contact with Carl Sagan. She was a guest on the show, along with her daughter, Sasha Sagan, many years ago. But when we think about the multiverse, there are these different levels of it, as past guest and friend Max Tegmark talks about. Nobody disputes that there's regions of the cosmos we can't access that are beyond what is called the observable horizon, or the Hubble radius in some cases. Very many people start to disagree when you get above level 2 in the multiverse. So I guess I want to start with Everett, because it's actually one of the more interesting aspects of both the microphysical manifestation of a multiverse, a lot of M's there, but also we'll connect later with the quantum mechanical kind of successor to it, which is the string theory landscape. So all of these are super controversial, and I think nothing in my particle. I had lunch with a condensed matter physicist yesterday. Yeah, they have their superconductivity claims, but nobody has the brawls that we have, that you're not doing physics, that you're what you're doing is bad for science and society, like Paul Steinhardt has said about. So tell me, why does this engender such hostility as compared to nemectic, superconductors, or type 2 phase transitions? Why is this so fraught with peril for a card-carrying scientist to wade into?
Well, I think there's a lot of public interest in what is called the multiverse. I call it the cultural multiverse. And that's so different from the scientific multiverse. So there's a lot of misunderstanding. And I think that might carry over to some physicists might say, hey, wait a minute, let's say they're in condensed matter physics, and they haven't read any papers about eternal inflation or something. So they don't know about eternal inflation and its claims. And all they hear about is, okay, some researchers doing multiverse stuff, and there's this idea that every time you make a decision in life, you branch out, and then there's all these versions of you out there somewhere. And, in the movies, there's all these versions of Spider-Man and, different versions of Flash and so forth. And they say, oh, wait a minute, these are just physicists who are trying to get grant money or trying to get credit for doing stuff that's just like science fiction, and it's just completely ridiculous stuff. And, but they might not even look into, some of these models. And I would argue that if you look into the idea of eternal inflation, and you look at evidence for inflation, and you look at the idea that inflation is very simple to generate using, as Andre Linde showed, then you say, wait a minute, why not other inflating regions that seems to make sense. And then if you have other inflating regions, you've essentially other places. You can call them other enclaves, or you could call them other universes. It's a question of terminology. You could say that the universe is this, super inflating, structure that emerged from the Big Bang, and that all the bubbles are just subsets of that. Or you could say that there's a multiverse and that we have our universe, which is what we see or detect, but there are other bubble universes out there, which is the usual way of saying that. And it's something that's very, scientific and stems from real theory. It stems from general relativity. If you have what is called a scalar field or an energy field, and it completely makes sense on a theoretical level and has absolutely nothing to do with the idea that you can walk through a portal and encounter a doppelganger who says to you, like, I'm the evil version of you, get out of my universe, or something like that. So, the two are so far apart. But I would imagine that the idea of the cultural multiverse might excite, especially among private donors, some interest in these ideas. So it's a benefit to some physicists, like, hey, there's a private donor out there who's a fan of Marvel Universe and is like really excited that somebody is studying what's called the multiverse in eternal inflation, trying to test eternal inflation. And then there are other people out there, scientists who might be on, let's say, a committee for an NSF grant and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not real science, and not even really look at, the technical details because maybe they don't know GR or don't know string theory or something like that, and just immediately dismiss the idea as being not pseudoscience. So it's a mixed bag.
This book kind of is in some level, if you had to only read one book, it might just be this one, because it weaves together so many of the different topics that you explored in, the Quantum Labyrinth, where you talked about quantum physics and flashes of a creation. You talked about the Big Bang Theory, which couples into, the origin of the universe, inflation, et cetera, time travel, et cetera, even, dark matter, and possible alien worlds, as you talked about much longer ago. Let's talk about two characters that appear in almost all of your books, John Wheeler and Richard Feynman. In this book, as opposed to Quantum Labyrinth, where you explore the intersecting lives of Feynman and his advisor, mentor, John Wheeler, it's quite surprising in some sense that they were also figures that played a role in the Everettian or many worlds interpretation type multiverse. And I've had on Sean Carroll for his book, and so he talks about the many worlds at that point. But what is in your mind the greatest strength of the many worlds interpretation, MWI, and perhaps some of its lacunae, failures, deficiencies? And I'll share some of mine as an experimental physicist when you're done.
I've been really interested in the life of John Wheeler, and it's correct that he appears in a few of my books, and Feynman as well as his student. And it's very interesting that some of her histories, which I mentioned in the Quantum Labyrinth, in some ways anticipates Everettian ideas, but it's different because you're not detecting these branches. These branches are things that are happening internally, whereas the Everettian view is that somehow Hilbert space becomes real, that this abstract quantum space is something that not just quantum systems live in, but also people live in, which is kind of an interesting idea. Wheeler was trying in the 1950s to come up with a quantum theory of gravity, and that was based on Feynman's idea of some of her histories. So he wanted to be able to come up with a universal wave function or universal quantum state of the universe, and then show how that kind of devolves, we would say these days decoheres into the classical universe we see. So that was Wheeler's ambition. And he set, as I mentioned in my book, Charles Misner, the job as a graduate student. Misner was assigned the task of, okay, well, why don't you come up with a quantum theory of general relativity, just like Feynman did for electrodynamics, I'm sure it will only take a few months. Just, write down the same types of Feynman diagrams and stuff for GR, and then you can have a quantum gravity. That will be, a quick project for your PhD. And, Misner, of course, discovered that he could only really start doing that. He really didn't make much headway, but that was Misner's thesis. But then Misner enticed Everett to get involved in kind of a similar project. And Everett attended a talk by Einstein about, that related to some of the problems with quantum physics. And one of the issues had to do with the fact that at that time, at least, we imagined that you would need a human observer to collapse the quantum wave function or quantum state down to what we see as a classical system. And Wheeler's problem with that was that you couldn't really have a human observer stand outside of the universe and collapse it that way. Later, Wheeler became interested in this idea of the participatory universe, in which an astronomer in the present day observes the past of the universe, and by observing the past, using retrocausality, collapses the universe. And that was, Wheeler thought that was a satisfactory solution to that problem, that someone from the future can cause quantum collapse in the past, which is kind of an interesting idea. I don't quite buy that, but interesting solution. But Everett's solution, inspired by Einstein's talk, where Einstein asked, could a mouse collapse the wave function, like kind of tongue-in-cheek? Everett said, well, wait a minute. Humans are part of the universe too. Humans are quantum systems. So really, humans should live in Hilbert space, just like quantum systems live in Hilbert space. And there should be a universal wave function that just evolves deterministically using the Schrodinger equation, Dirac equation, and so forth, just keeps going and never collapses. And just we would branch in our conscious existence every time there's a quantum measurement. We would observe all of the outcomes. So it would be seamless. There would not be, a special function to collapse the wave function, but everything would operate on the basis of the Schrodinger equation and other similar deterministic equations. So there's a certain elegance to that, and I see that the idea of Hilbert space is pretty weird. So the question is adding the fact that people bifurcate in Hilbert space along with other things being stretched out or blended in Hilbert space much weirder. I can see a case for the fact that we don't experience that as, an argument against that. But at the same time, I think that Hilbert space, the idea that an electron can live, in multiple dimensions in Hilbert space and evolve that way is pretty weird. And, it doesn't seem beyond plausibility that human consciousness can be spread out over different dimensions in Hilbert space as well.
When I look at, and I had this conversation with Sean Carroll, who's one of the most popular, expositors or most noteworthy expositors of the many worlds, he almost assumes to me that it's a done deal, that it's the correct interpretation, that everything else, Copenhagen, is to be dispensed with. And you go into great, excellent detail about how Wheeler was very much influenced by Bohr and very much reluctant to give up. It almost reminded me of when Lemaitre allegedly told Einstein about the Big Bang solution of, GR. He said, your math is okay, but your physics is atrocious. And it seemed like Wheeler reacted that way. Sean and others are reacting almost the opposite. And so I wonder, and I asked him this, what would it take to actually falsify, the many worlds interpretation? Is it possible that you can do an experiment that would reveal this branching ratio? And I should also say that it's not at all clear to me that it's always presented as Schrodinger's cat has, a binary outcome, living and dead, because that's the way we perceive cats, normally. But in fact, in any quantum system, there's an infinite superposition, as well as for the cat. So to say that it's living or dead is to kind of
impose upon an artificiality and this artifice that there's only two outcomes of every quantum measurement, which is nonsense. So I believe that when I asked him about this, he said something like, well, the rate of branching into different worlds, is extremely short. It's a billionth of an attosecond or something. It's not out of the question. It could be measured. Who knows? But the point is there any observable signature that could distinguish between the many worlds scenario and the Copenhagen interpretation? In other words, are we just debating who the taste of things, and as the French say, or the Latins say, the Romans say, de gusto est non est disputandum. So taste is not debatable. So let me ask you, can we falsify many worlds, branching ratios, etc.? Is there any crisp experiment, in the words of Popper, that could be done to distinguish these two different interpretations?
So I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head that the biggest problem with many worlds is this idea of the branching ratio, also known as the Born rule. And we always use the example of Schrodinger's cat. It's kind of binary, like live or dead. And then you have, spin states, could be up, you spin up or spin down. But then you say, hey, wait a minute, like an electron could be, if you have some kind of marker, it could be like 0.0167, nanometers from the marker or something else. And then you have this continuous system. And then you say, okay, the probability of it ending up like that is a certain amount. And then you say, wait a minute, like how could many worlds get that branching ratio if it's like some tiny fraction of a thousandth or something, like 0.0003. Like, do you have all these multiple possibilities out there? Do you have thousands of branches? Do you have millions of branches, trillions of branches out there? And somehow the many worlds gets them exactly right on the nail, that the probabilities end up that way. So that I find a little far-fetched, but philosophers of physics have been trying to tackle that using the idea of betting theory, that somebody would make a wager that of something ending up a certain way, and based upon their knowledge of quantum physics and the Born rule, the wager would end up being similar to the outcome, and therefore they would get a certain reward, and that would weigh the chances that they would pick that outcome, because they would want the reward that would exactly match up with the outcome of the Born rule. So it would be kind of a gambler's method of guaranteeing the Born rule. And I don't know if I quite buy into that. But to answer your question about falsifiability, and I think the problem is that decoherence, which is the idea that the environment influences a quantum system, can only get you so far, and can't quite explain why in certain cases you almost immediately or instantly get a single outcome instead of a blur of outcomes. And the big argument to me in favor of many worlds is that every other method for spontaneous localization or any kind of experimental idea of, that the environment will localize things precisely, has come out short. So I almost see, many worlds as kind of a default solution if you can't really explain things dynamically. But I'm kind of thinking that someday maybe there'll be a successful way to explain quantum collapse dynamically. We haven't been able to do that yet exactly, but in that case, many worlds will be ruled out. So it's more like it's the default way of explaining something if you can't find a dynamical way to explain it. And I would extend that to cosmology. If somebody could find a way to exactly explain why there is only one universe and that there's only one inflation event and rule out everything else, or if someone could come up with a dynamical way to say, hey, there's only one viable string theory vacuum and that we can rule out all the others, then, these multiverse ideas would eventually disappear because people wouldn't have to consider other possibilities. But the reason they're out there is because we say, okay, without a dynamical method, maybe, as a maybe a last resort, or, an alternative, we can say that there's a, range of options out there, and that we explain, one of them because it's the one where we're here, but the other possibilities are out there. And isn't this an elegant way, in the absence of dynamical methods, to come up with a solution? So it's kind of a default way of explaining something if you don't have a dynamical solution.
We touch upon a few things in that answer, including inflation, which we're going to spend some time on, is near and dear to my paycheck. That's how bread is buttered around the Keating household. But you also mentioned, in the context of quantum collapse, et cetera, we touched a little bit upon these major questions, and I think one of them is explored in this book. It's a really unsung hero of physics. I don't know, you're the expert. Has anyone ever written a biography of Bob Dickey?
Yeah, I do think he's an unsung hero. I played a role a few years ago in honoring him at Princeton. We set up a historic plaque, and Kip Thorne was there. Kip Thorne wasn't a student of Dickey, but he was very much influenced by Dickey, because Dickey was the experimentalist with some theoretical ideas, who was kind of a counterpart to Wheeler's theory.
Right.
And the two of them, I found out relatively recently, kind of made a bet on observations of gravitational lensing, and Dickey thought that eventually solar eclipse experiments and so forth would reveal that that general relativity is not completely correct, and that instead of the gravitational constant G, you have a scalar field instead, a changing scalar field, which was what we called Brans-Dickey Jordan models, and Dickey really believed in that. So he didn't really believe in conventional GR, which was kind of ironic, because he helped interpret the CMB, but
that's right.
His interpretation was that there was a previous version of the universe that collapsed, and that produced the Big Bang, and that the CMB was leftover noise from the previous universe. And I credit Peebles for also interpreting it as a single Big Bang singularity.
The Dickey paper is published as a companion to the Penzias and Wilson discovery paper, and Penzias just passed away at age 90. We should recognize his influence. And that paper never mentions the Big Bang once. There's no mention of it. They talk about a cyclic, previous cycle and stuff like that. So Peebles may have had influence in later years, but for that companion paper, which they were trying to stake their claims for discovering it, and it's really kind of tragic in some ways, because Dickey did measure the CMB. He just forgot about it, or he forgot, the level that he had measured in the 40s or 50, 40s and 50s, and forgotten about the fact that, this could be a very, easily, and they were trying to measure it on top of Jadwin Hall, or back in the early 60s, when he made the famous call into his boys that they've been scooped. But the reason I bring him up is because he kind of pointed out a lot of these, planted these, he's kind of like planting talisman along the path that would eventually influence Guth, to have his spectacular realization in double boxed letters in his lab notebook. Why a theorist needs a lab notebook is beyond me, but he did as a struggling postdoc at SLAC, and he was influenced by this kind of fine tuning issue. And I wonder if you can talk about that Dickey had alerted him to, which is really about the flatness of the universe, if I remember correctly.
Dickey was trying to make the claim that the universe is special and we can't really explain it dynamically, the flatness of the universe, and the fact that omega is so close to zero, which is the constant telling us what the curvature of the universe is. And if omega deviated even slightly from zero in the beginning, it would be huge today, and the universe would be so curved that it wouldn't have evolved in the same way. So these are really interesting questions that Bob Dickey pointed out, and it's related to the isotropy problem in the universe. that why is the universe so isotropic? And then finally, Misner was the one who brought up the horizon problem. Why is the universe, the cosmic background radiation, so correlated across different sky directions? And these first led Misner to develop what's called the mixmaster model of the universe. And I talk about that in my book, that people were thinking, inspired by Wheeler, about all these weird alternative versions of GR, and including ones in which instead of a uniform Big Bang, you have the universe expanding in two directions and contracting in a third direction, and then kind of changing directions almost in a chaotic way of contraction and expansion in something that almost resembles tossing dice or flipping a coin, because you go through maybe 3 cycles one way, and then suddenly you go through like 18 cycles. And this mixmaster model was changing directions, and it's named after a blender, like blending the universe together to try to get this uniformity, to try to get all the radiation at the same temperature. And it was, a valid solution to GR, but not the standard solution. It wasn't the Friedman, Robertson, Walker solution to the universe. These kind of stirred up interest in alternatives. And, Dickey was involved in looking at alternatives to, the standard Big Bang. And Dickey, at some point, asked the question of what is the role of humanity in ruling out other alternatives. And that kind of led Brandon Carter and others to kind of talk about what Carter called the anthropic principle. So often, the anthropic principle is attributed not just to Brandon Carter, who coined the term in 1970, but also to Bob Dickey, who speculated earlier, like what is the human role in ruling out other things, and the fact that that life develops at a certain phase of the history of the universe kind of places certain bounds on how the universe develops. You need a universe that's, a certain number of billions of years old, to develop, develop stable planets and to develop life. And Dickey thought that was kind of an interesting coincidence that we live in a certain time of the universe and in a certain region of the universe, and that kind of can help explain some of the constants of the universe, that they have to be a certain way, and helps resolve the fine-tuning problem, because if the constants were different and the universe, didn't last, billions of years and only lasted, hundreds of millions of years, then you would never have stable structures such as stars developing, sun-like stars developing, and you wouldn't have planets like Earth, and you wouldn't have life, and no one would have been able to talk about the universe. So that was the beginning of what we call the anthropic principle.
Hey there, it's your captain again, exploring the multiverse with the brilliant physicist Paul Halpern. And I know that you've been interested in these incredible discoveries that we're hoping to make in experimental cosmology, which sometimes get hampered by these little objects here, micrometeorites, small versions of this chunk of space dust that you can get yourself by joining my Monday Magic mailing list, which comes out once a week, where I talk about the hottest, coolest science news, exclusive content, and giveaways. And you'll be entered to win if you go to briankeating.com/list to win one of these space suckers. And I hope that you'll enjoy it. And if you have a .edu email address, as Paul does, you can be guaranteed to win one of these guaranteed 4 billion year old piece of space rock called a meteorite. Go to briankeating.com/edu if you have a .edu email address. Enjoy it.
For me, the kind of curious thing when we think about this is all the diverging sort of opinions, including the diverging opinions of the, kind of founding fathers of the inflationary universe and the bubble kind of cosmological implications that come from what's called new inflation, or what was called new inflation. It's 45 years old now, or 40 years old. You really can't call it new. It's not a spring chicken anymore, right? But let's talk about these two ideas and I have two kind of things in mind from me that I've come upon in my research, but also in conversation with Andre Linde. I haven't talked to Alan Guth. I keep meaning to do it. We've collaborated and had many wonderful discussions, but he told me he'd come on the podcast as soon as he's done cleaning up his office. So yeah. So Alan said, as you quote in the book, essentially all inflationary models are eternal. In my opinion, this makes inflation very robust. If it starts anywhere at any time in eternity, it produces an infinite number of pocket universes. And Linde has said similarly, and essentially it's very difficult to find inflationary solutions that don't produce multiverses. But Paul Steinhardt, who's, I call him, kind of the deadbeat dad of inflation. He's denying paternity, and he's kind of thinks this wretched Frankenstein, he regrets that he ever sired it or was responsible for it. And he says the following. He says in an oral history that you quote, any combination of properties that's physically allowed by the fundamental laws will occur an infinite number of times. Everything is possible. Nothing is preferred. Such is the nature of the multiverse, which is a very nice name for saying what I call a theoretical disaster. And Paul's told me, and he's written it elsewhere, the multiverse is not only dangerous for cosmology, and not only is it dangerous for science in general, but he's called it a danger to society as well. How do we reconcile these things? They're all eminent scientists. Paul even has an alternative cosmology called the bouncing or cyclic cosmology, which we can talk about along with my friend and past guest Andy Aegis and Neil Turok. It seems inarguable that the multiverse comes concomitantly with inflation. Would you agree?
I've interviewed Paul Steinhardt. I interviewed him at a key period in his career for an earlier book. I went to his office at Princeton, and I interviewed him about the cyclic universe shortly after he developed it. And I asked him, why did you develop the cyclic universe? At that time, it was called the ekpyrotic universe. Apparently, there's some differences between that and the cyclic universe. As Justin Corey points out, the ekpyrotic was the original name, and Corey was on the first paper, but not on the second paper. There are some subtle differences, but they're essentially the same thing. And I interviewed Paul Steinhardt, and I said, why, as one of the founders of inflation, why are you developing this? And at that time, he said, well, we need to be open-minded. We can't assume that inflation is necessarily correct. So we need to have alternatives. So I think at that point, he was a little bit agnostic about whether or not inflation is okay or not. But, since then, he's really turned against inflation. And now this idea of multiverse being dangerous to science and anti-scientific, I don't quite see that, especially because if I were to explain to, let's say, somebody who's not in theoretical physics, the idea of the cyclic cosmology and say 1 millimeter or whatever the amount is away from us, there is another universe, which we call a brain world in another dimension. And at any moment it can collide with us, and it has collided in the past and will collide in the future. And it's just out there, just, closer in the higher dimension, than the length of our finger. They would say, wait a minute, that's not science. That's just speculation. That's, so it's hard for me to see why internal inflation is not science if we accept something like brain world models. To me, they're both delightful ways to take things that we do know about, like GR, general relativity, and extend them, and take things we know about, like quantum field theory, and extend them, and kind of speculate about, other possibilities. And I really like the idea that brain worlds have of explaining the weakness of gravity, the hierarchy problem, why gravity is so much weaker than the other forces, by kind of imagining gravity kind of, as I see it, kind of exuding or spreading out along a higher dimension or being captured by a higher dimension. I think it's a really brilliant way to explain it. So I'm not opposed to brain world ideas. I think they should be examined. And I'm not opposed to internal inflation ideas, even though aspects of them are not completely testable. And of the two, I think eternal inflation comes more within the bounds of scientific rigor because there's so much evidence out there based upon analysis of the CMB for slow roll inflation. And even Justin Corey, who was on the ekpyrotic universe paper, said at this point he thinks that almost everyone in the astrophysics community is a supporter of inflation, which means that they support eternal inflation because that's the most logical version of inflation. So he, not to say that he's broken with Steinhardt, but he's very much interested in standard inflation at this point.
In the book, let's turn this now to my favorite subject, which is me, and the Bicep 2 instrument. So I created Bicep 1 with Jamie Bach and the late great Andrew Lang, my postdoc mentor, back in 2000. Hard to believe, 24 years have gone by. And it was later upgraded to be Bicep 2. And exactly 10 years ago, when this episode comes out, most likely, or a little bit after, before this episode comes out, March 17, 2014, so 10 years ago, incredible. People woke up to hear and read headlines in the New York Times, space ripples reveal Big Bang's smoking gun. And of course, this wasn't to be, as my book is called Losing the Nobel Prize, my first book, my 3-4 books. And so it wasn't to be. Obviously, it went away. But there were immediately not only claims of detection of inflation, but also detections of the multiverse. So Max Tegmark in the Huffington Post wrote on that very morning, "Good morning, inflation. Hello, multiverse." And what the discovery was would be, the implications of it, and how it would give rise perhaps to new vistas in our understanding of reality. And then past guest Lawrence Krauss opined that this was not only the death knell of alternatives like the ekpyrotic or the colliding brains or cyclic models or Sir Roger Penrose's conformal cyclic model, but it was the end of the need for supernatural shenanigans. It was the end of God, basically. We didn't need God. And it was interesting because also in a post by the Discovery Institute, I think it was, which is a Christian apology website, and with many eminent scientists and thinkers involved with it, some of whom have been on the show. But they said this is quite the contrary. This is evidence for the existence of God, and it kind of made me sympathetic to Paul Steinhardt's viewpoint that anything that can happen will happen. How is this part of the scientific endeavor? So what do you say to people who make those claims, Paul?
Well, I kind of remember with those announcements, and it was a very exciting time. And I kind of remember even Paul Steinhardt was kind of saying, well, maybe inflation is right after all. So he kind of was kind of becoming convinced too at that time. Later, of course, he went back to saying, that eternal inflation is not scientific. The implications of it, the multiverse implications. But there has been a serious quest for proving eternal inflation through the idea of bubble collisions. And I mentioned in my book about Hiranya Pires and her team of Matthew Johnson and so forth, trying to look in the CMB for scars of collisions of bubbles of other universes. And they have, there are mathematical models out there that they're trying to perfect, trying to do simulations of collisions with other bubble universes, and trying, very hard to look for a signature of the idea of eternal inflation and bubble collisions. And so far, it has, there have been some hints of it, but nothing that's with statistical significance. And I think teams have also been looking for what are called polarization profiles, which is near and dear to your heart, of evidence of bubble collisions too. And so far, nothing's been found with statistical significance. But it's possible in the future with even higher resolution maps of the CMB and its polarization profile. And just for you viewers, light can be polarized in different directions, and that can provide evidence of early interactions and the effect of gravitational waves and so forth on the early universe. So that it's an interesting avenue of inquiry, looking at the CMB not just for temperature fluctuations but also polarization differences. Getting a little bit technical. But,
no, that's fine. My audience is the brightest in the multiverse. So
okay.
You're at home here.
Anyway, if people say, well, can you prove the multiverse or disprove it? I think the best, it'll be only one type of multiverse, but the best opportunity would be if they could find scars of evidence of bubble collisions in the CMBR. So I'm still holding out hope for that.
Absolutely. And you quote from Hiranya, and I want to make one point. She is on the external advisory committee for the Simons Observatory, for which I serve as PI, principal investigator. And she's been a wealth of insight and knowledge. And part of that was born out of the Bicep 2 affair, that we needed a check and balance to the exuberance that all scientists have when their work is operating at the high stakes that we had with Bicep 2. And different types of pursuits are worthy of having an internal kitchen cabinet, if you will, that we sorely lacked with Bicep 2. And in fact, we never even shared it with the results. We, meaning me, including for collective punishment and blame. But John Kovac, the PI of Bicep 2, especially, they shared it with Andre Linde, as you talk about in the book, with my friend Chalin Kuo going up there with champagne. And the video is still up on Stanford's, YouTube channel. It's got 3 million views. I'd kill for some of those some days on my videos, but it's still there. And I've talked, Chalin's a great friend, and there was almost no, comeuppance that happened. I mean, Bicep continues creatively. It went from Bicep 1, Bicep 2, Bicep 3. Now it's Bicep Array. And the lessons that we learned were we can't only seek to confirm that inflation is true. We need to also have guardrails against the possible imprimatur of inflation being mimicked, mocked by dust grains, microscopic grains of dust that act as inflationary interlopers. And by the way, I give away the villain of my book, Losing the Nobel Prize. I give away little tiny meteorites, not micrometeorites, but I give away meteorites to anyone who's got a .edu email address gets a meteorite if they live in the USA. So you get one, Paul, because you have one .edu email address, but go to briankeiting.com/edu and you'll get one. And if you don't have an edu email address, you're not fortunate enough to be in the academe as Paul and I are, you can take your chances. I give away one randomly to a signer upper at briankeiting.com/list. So anyway, that's my plug, but also for Hiranya serving in such a valuable role as someone who's really trying to make sure that we are most suspicious, as Feynman said, that we are the biggest fool. And she, even though she has a horse in this race, as does Paul Steinhardt, who is a past member of the External Advisory Committee. We've got experimentalists, theorists, data analysts, and not just people like Alan Guth reading over the preprint. So she says in this paper, when you talk about Lightbird, which is a successor space experiment, NASA JAXA collaboration, very, very tangentially involved with. Some of my students are involved with it. She talks about the data from the Simons Observatory, which we're scheduled to get first light in April, Paul. It's very exciting. Jim Simons' 86th birthday is coming up. I promised him that present back in 2015 when we pitched him the idea. She talks about the bubble collisions, and I want to talk about that, eternal inflation. She says, I think the chances are slim, she said to you, because nature has been so kind to us to see a signal, but these tests should be done because the implications of the theory are so monumentous. There may be another avenue to test the physical understanding of the bubble nucleation process itself through a completely different method. I'm part of a consortium, this quantum simulator for fundamental physics. As one of our wrap-up questions today, when I think about these bubble universes, they're really kind of not that different from, kind of the island universes that people once thought galaxies were, right? Immanuel Kant and others, hypothesized that the Andromeda, nebula or something, eventually we called the Andromeda Nebula, the Great Spiral Nebula, is actually a galaxy. And these galaxies, as you've pointed out many times, Einstein thought the Milky Way was the universe, and effectively it is. We're kind of bound, captured, and beholden to the cruelty of the speed of light being so slow. But tell me, Paul, if there were bubble universes, if there was, as Philip K. Dick said, there's a universe right next door. I hear it's pretty cool. If there was a universe a couple of light years away from our universe, I've been wondering about what would be the implication for things like Mach's principle, in that we believe that these kind of an inertial reference frame is one at which all the fixed stars, and you can replace fixed stars with fixed galaxies. But would that not be invalidated in a scenario where there's bubble universes literally one light day away, so that tomorrow Hiranya may celebrate its discovery? Is it not possible that Mach's law could be invalidated if there's even one such thing? Wouldn't that violate Mach's principle, Lorentz invariance, all sorts of things?
Mach's principle is interesting from a historic point of view. It's basically Mach speculated that inertia is the result of the distant stars or the combined influence of massive objects in the universe. And Einstein was motivated by Mach's principle to develop general relativity. But Einstein soon found out through a paper by de Sitter's first paper, the de Sitter cosmology, that you can have an empty space and you still have, de Sitter showed you could still have inertia without having matter, and kind of proved that he took a point mass in his paper and said that the point mass would be at rest, and it didn't matter, no pun intended, that there was no matter in the universe. You can have a vacuum universe and still have inertia. So he kind of disproved Mach's principle. And Dickey, speaking of Dickey, was trying to revive Mach's principle. And I think Dennis Sciama and other cosmologists tried to come up with alternatives to GR. But if you believe in GR does not address Mach's principle. So the idea of bubble universes would not, I don't think, have any bearing on that. But it would call into question the idea of the specialness. And this is, I think, Paul Steinhardt's big contention, the specialness of our own universe, because you wouldn't really be able to use inflation to do fine-tuning anymore. You'd have to use something like the anthropic principle and say, well, all the bubble universes are just not suitable. The cosmological constant's too high. They expand too quickly, or, strength of gravity is not right. Strength of electromagnetism is not right. We're in the Goldilocks universe. We're in the one that's just perfect for development of structure and the development of life. And that becomes more of a philosophical argument, which some people don't really like.
Yes, they definitely don't. Maybe the last question, I was reading the book, I was, Princeton always plays a big role in everything in cosmology and quantum mechanics. It's impossible for the viewer, et cetera, to not notice that. But I was reminded of past guest Juan Maldesena's heroic work in the realm of kind of the ADS CFT and sort of the response that was leading to a unification of concepts as disparate as the quantum fields at the early universe and the extreme early universe by invoking this anti-de Sitter space, but also ranging to things like holography, et cetera. I wonder, could there be a similar Rosetta Stone that would map between the microphysical landscape, which governs string theory, and the macrophysical multiverse? Is there some lookup table? Is there some Rosetta Stone, as I say? Is that a possibility to have a Maldacenian unification between these two inarguably different skills?
Well, there's so many different string vacua, but if you believe in string theory, and some people do because it's, a finite theory, quantum finite field theory, so that's, immediately a strong argument for the idea that things aren't point particles, because then you get a finite theory. So once you say, okay, things are finite strands of energy rather than point particles, let's explore the possibilities, you immediately are led to the idea of a 10 or 11 dimensional universe that immediately leads you to compactification. And then, as we know, there's 10 to the 500th power ways that you can compactify, and each of them implies a different version, a different quantum field theory of the 3+1 dimensional universe. So the compactification tells you what physics goes on in our universe that we observe. And one of them is, or at least one of them is the standard model, we hope. But there's an argument that maybe, and I don't know if some, advanced computer can somehow someday go through all those possibilities, but there's an argument that a large chunk of them would not influence anything that's viable, and that only a very small subset would even lead to, for example, eternal inflation or inflation, and most of those models would just fizzle out. So if you could somehow go through all of those possibilities and say, okay, there's a small subset that are viable, and those produce, let's say, different variations, different versions of the universe in kind of an eternal inflation theory, and that most of those have, cosmological constant, which is not viable, then you can narrow it down further. So the idea is to keep narrowing it down and narrowing down until you get a universe which has the standard model of particle physics, has a very small cosmological constant, and you say, okay, that's our universe. We got it, and we live here, so that's why we're here. And now we can say string theory is right. So that's the idea in the far future for unifying everything through string theory, internal inflation, anthropic principle, and then you get our universe. Maybe wishful thinking, but some people believe it.
Paul Halpern is a professor of physics at St. Joseph's University and the author of 18 popular science books, including maybe his 19th being written right now. His books include Flashes of Creation, The Quantum Labyrinth, Einstein's Dice, Schrodinger's Cat, and Synchronicity. He's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and is a fellow of the American Physical Society. He lives near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and recently published this delightful, delicious, alluring book, The Allure of the Multiverse, Extra Dimensions, Other Worlds, and Parallel Universes, which tells the epic story of how science and society, culture, became besotted with the multiverse and the controversies surrounding it. Paul, I can't thank you enough for your appearance today. It's always such a great time to be with you and spend so much of your valuable time. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you, Brian. It was a pleasure being on your show. Thank you.
If you've come with me all the way to the end of the multiverse, I know you'll love my previous interviews with Paul Halpern. Click here for those. And here's a playlist for the best episodes from the past few weeks. See you next Sunday on Into the Impossible.